नमस्ते दोस्तों, आज के वीडियो में आपका स्वागत है। आज हम पढ़ेंगे इंट्रोडक्शन टू कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल हिस्ट्री, नेटिव स्टेट्स इन इंडिया एंड देयर लीगल स्टेटस, द डॉक्ट्रिन ऑफ पैरामाउंटसी, ग्रोथ ऑफ ब्रिटिश पैरामाउंटसी ओवर नेटिव स्टेट्स, डेवलपमेंट ऑफ लेजिस्लेटिव इंस्टीट्यूशंस इन इंडिया, evolution of central legislative authority, Indian Councils Act of 1861, background and need, key provisions of the Indian Councils Act 1861, significance and limitations of the 1861 Act, legacy of the Indian Councils Act 1861, introduction to constitutional history. The constitutional history of India is a study of how British rule introduced structured governance and legal systems to manage the vast and diverse Indian subcontinent. It is also a record of how the British Crown and Parliament attempted to administer, control, and eventually reform Indian governance systems. This evolution involved not only British territories, but also native princely states that remained semi-autonomous yet subordinate, native states in India and their legal status. Before the British fully established themselves, India was composed of various kingdoms, chiefdoms, and principalities, collectively called native states or princely states. These entities had their own rulers, laws, and governance systems. With the gradual expansion of the British East India Company's rule, these states came under British control in a subordinate capacity without being directly annexed or ruled. These states were not considered foreign territories. Instead, they were treated as subordinate but autonomous. They retained control over internal affairs but were restricted in foreign policy and military matters.
The doctrine of paramountcy. The doctrine of paramountcy was a political and legal theory developed by the British to justify their supremacy over the native states. It declared the British Crown as the paramount power in India. The native states were allowed to function only under the overall control of the British Crown. It provided the British the legal pretext to interfere in succession, external affairs, and internal governance of these states. This doctrine was not codified in a single document, but evolved over time through practice, treaties, and precedents. Growth of British paramountcy over native states. British paramountcy over princely states developed through treaties and agreements. Many native rulers signed treaties that acknowledged British supremacy.
Subsidiary alliances, Wellesley's policy. Indian rulers accepted British troops in their territory in exchange for protection, further reducing their autonomy. Annexations and doctrine of lapse, Dalhousie's policy. States were annexed when rulers died without a male heir. Control over succession and administration. The British began to decide who could succeed native rulers, thus weakening traditional systems. By the mid-19th century, the British had asserted almost complete political control, even over princely states that appeared to be self-governing. Development of legislative institutions in India. Initially, legislative powers were concentrated in the hands of the East India Company's directors and their councils. However, as governance became complex, especially after the 1857 revolt, it became necessary to create representative and consultative legislative bodies. Legislative development in British India went through several phases.
Charter Act of 1833, centralized legislation under the Governor-General in Council. Charter Act of 1853, introduced open competition for civil services and separated legislative and executive functions. Indian Councils. Act of 1861, brought major structural reforms and began the process of Indian representation. Evolution of central legislative authority. With the Indian Councils Act of 1861, the process of including Indians in governance and lawmaking began. Legislative authority was now vested in the Governor-General in Council. The new structure allowed for the addition of non-official members, including Indians. It decentralized legislation by restoring the legislative powers of the presidencies of Bombay and Madras.
This act marked the first formal step toward representation and consultation in colonial governance. Indian Councils Act of 1861, background and need. After the revolt of 1857, the British Crown took over administration from the East India Company. The rebellion highlighted a disconnect between the rulers and the Indian people. There was an urgent need to win the confidence of Indian elites, involve Indians in governance, at least symbolically, decentralize power to make governance more efficient. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 was the first legislative step in this direction. Key provisions of the Indian Councils Act 1861, reconstitution of the Executive Council. The Governor-General's Executive Council now included 6 members, with at least one being a legal expert.
Restoration of legislative powers to provinces. The Act restored legislative powers to the presidencies of Bombay and Madras, which had been taken away in 1833. Introduction of legislative councils. The Governor-General was empowered to nominate additional members, both official and non-official, to the Legislative Council. Indians could now be included as non-official members, an important symbolic gesture. Lawmaking powers. The Council could legislate for the entire British India. Laws passed had to receive assent from the Governor-General and could be disallowed by the British Crown. Limitations. The nominated Indian members had no real power. No representation of the general Indian population was ensured. Significance and limitations of the 1861 Act. Significance.
It introduced the principle of consultation with Indians, marked the beginning of representative institutions in India, laid the foundation for future legislative reforms. Limitations. The legislative councils were only advisory. Power remained concentrated in British hands. Representation was limited and not based on elections. Despite these limitations, it set the stage for the Indian Councils Acts of 1892, 1909, and eventually the Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935. Legacy of the Indian Councils Act 1861. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 was the first constitutional instrument to incorporate Indians into the colonial legislative process. Although limited in scope and purpose, it was a landmark in British colonial policy. It reflected a shift from purely imperial rule to a more consultative form of administration, though still far from democratic. It also symbolized the beginning of India's long constitutional journey that would culminate in independence and the making of a sovereign constitution in 1950. धन्यवाद दोस्तों, मिलते हैं अगले वीडियो में एक नए टॉपिक के साथ.